So, I think I'm going to start making a habit of doing what I'm going to call community highlights, where if I see a very interesting post, I will react to it, I guess. So, here we are. Before we get into it, I have a Patreon if you want to join the cause. I sell men's health aids at Peak Male Physique. You can pre-order adequately dosed blends of supplements at leviathansups.com. Can't believe I'm forgetting the name of my own site. Anyway, so I'm just going to call him Nanobots. He did a post the other day on the therapeutic effects of temperature on connective tissues. And if you know anything about penis, like me, the connective tissue that surrounds the penis, called the tunica albuginea, is the limiting factor for most gains because it's very resilient, very strong for its size, and on top of that, connective tissues in general heal slowly, therefore change slowly. He went through and found studies that showed the effects of heat on tendons and connective tissues and how they change the tensile strength, the stretch rate, etc. And then we can what's it called? It's one of those big fancy words Derek always uses, not pontificate. Extrapolate. We can extrapolate this data and apply it to the penis. And he also says that he's not a doctor. Neither am I. The only doctor I know in this field is Hank. And that should not discredit you from showcasing good science, okay? All right, so the first point doesn't really have to do with heat. But number one, and you're going to see why I wasn't putting Get to classes, because I can't read out loud. There is a section that discusses the application of stress, velocity/amount, which seems to indicate it's best to work up to higher amounts of resistance slowly and to warm tissues up before diving into a set. While the veterans here are consistently advising to start with low weight resistance, I've seen a lot of comments from newbies who seem to think it is a waste of time. This research would seem to support the idea that not only are you setting yourself up for injury, but jumping to too much resistance will likely make for worse results. Connective tissue has a high resistance to any sudden application of stress. This protective function of restraining tissues allows the intense disruption. This protective function of restraining tissues allows the intense muscular activity of work and play without joint disruption. The scientist Van Brocklin showed that the protective vasculoelastic property of dense connective tissues can be overcome by the rate at which stress is applied. In his study, tendons subjected to rapid rates of stress of elongated to 3% compared to 5% with low velocity stress. The yield of soft tissues is inversely related to the amount of force applied. The work at Warren et al. Showed that ironically the decreases on a load on tendons by half the result in a threefold increase in length. It is speculated that our tissues have adapted to resist heavy loads but do not recognize low levels of forces as pathologic. Alright, so let's break that down. If you tug real hard on your penis, actually let's start even more basic. So let's say you jump. All that tension in your legs is going to cause your tendons to stiffen up to handle that energy, essentially. And that way, your joints are strong enough to handle without your knee buckling. If we now stretch our knee out and then slowly apply more tension to it, that ligament will begin to relax. So basically, any abrupt force is going to cause your body to flex and getting ready to handle this new load. However, with lower weights and a lower pull out, essentially, your body does not respond the same way as it has ample time to better handle this load, essentially. So I think what he was looking at is like, this is why you need to start with low weights. I think this is more showing that to get maximum stretch, you actually need to pyramid your weight or your tension up throughout your session. So If you're hanging, you would want to start at, say, about 5 pounds, but over the hour, you add a couple pounds every 20 minutes. I call this pyramid sets, and apparently I've been doing this doing this scientifically for, I don't know, for 2 years, and you guys see my gains. You know that I've had relatively good gains. This is because, one, your tissues can technically handle more load, but when you shock it with, say, 12 pounds, it's just going to stiffen up. That's why I start with 5, work to 7.5, 10, 12.5, and then I actually work my way back down. When I have time. I have no time right now for any of that. And this also shows why side-to-side stretches is also kind of stupid, because you're doing that jerking motion. That is a bunch of quick stress. And now it makes me want to rethink my recommendation of GI stretches a bit, but that's more or less kind of a pulse to keep that tissue relaxed and spry almost. So nothing's going to change with my recommendation for GI stretches for beginners. Point number 2, this article seems to suggest that intermittent stress is better than constant stress for the same duration. My interpretation here was that there may be a benefit to splitting a session into sets, as generally recommended for hanging, with some rest in between doing so, versus doing one long set at the same time at this under tension. I haven't heard any recommendations for specific periodic periods when using an ADS, but I'm curious if this research may support the potentially benefit of adding rest between sets. Okay, so originally sets for hanging and stuff like that was for safety. We were avoiding hypoxia in the glands. Now, personally, I've always taken, so if I'm doing, say, an hour of hanging, I usually split that up to a half hour, but that's when I was changing the weights for my pyramid sets. So, I mean, it could be a thing. And if you want to think about it logically, we are saying you're getting it to elongate a bit, but as that tissue fatigues, it will release more and more and more. If you give it a second to relax while fatigued, then you should be able to stretch it more because it's not fighting as much, if that makes sense. So there's probably some research to it. My only issue with worrying about how much you're actually stretching comes down to, is that causing the stimulus needed for growth? What we need to really look into to see is if the stretch mechanism, longer stretch mechanisms, releases more growth factors when stretched. On paper, I believe Davis's law states that between 4 to 6% of your stretched length would be the area you want to be stretched to. So if you're 6 inches, you want to be about 6.6. So you want to be about 6.25 to 6.4 in stretched length. Going beyond that, I'm not sure that will actually have a return on investment. He also points out that these sets cause the tissue to relax, elongated essentially, because it's getting, I want to say that is causing more breakdown of the tendon in this case than it would be with 1 hour, because it gets used to handling that load. And then it's it's a little, I don't want to say it's outside my wheelhouse, but it's something I haven't really thought about. Number 3, the idea of passive healing sleeves or an ADS, all-day stretcher, after a more active form of PE to cement games seems controversial. This article may seem to suggest it helps. Most clinical studies of duration of stress, one of the sessions of prolonged duration stretch is used by varying up from 15 to 20 minutes up to 1 hour. Gains to be maximized when the stretched tissues are held at the new length and range for at least 1 hour by any mean of splints. Okay, so first let's define stretched when we are talking about this. Does that mean we are only going to our bone press stretched length? Or are we just, or somewhere in between that and our normal flaccid? Second, what kind of tension are we putting on this tissue? If it's longer than our bone press flaccid stretch length, that's technically more work, and that could actually have detrimental effects on penis enlargement. I do recommend wearing a cock ring after girth sessions, and that's similar to this. The nice thing about girth is that you really can't overdo the overexpansion, because otherwise you'd start to literally break apart the tunica. For length, it becomes a little more complicated because the issue is with all-day stretchers, there are more... They are also said that you can gain length with them alone. I think that's bullshit. You need to be in that 4 to 6% range of elongation to, start seeing these gains based off of the science that we have. You're not going to get that amount of tension with an all-day stretcher. And if you are, you're not going to be wearing it for 6 hours a day. If for active, we'll call it active recovery, after a length routine, I personally don't do it. But I do know people that have had results with it, so I'm not going to rate it off. It's just like, I've already put an hour in. I think the growth factors are enough. Let's save these more like advanced stuff to when you have issues gaining. Because you don't want to like throw the entire pot at it, and then when the stimulus finally dries out, you don't have anything to do, right? So I would save healing in elongated state until your first plateau, for example. Number 4. There are a lot of people who seem to be strong proponents of heat. The article would seem the assertions helps a lot. In order to affect any physiological changes in these tissues, it is necessary to raise the temperature to above 40 degrees Celsius. That would be about 105 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit. And deliver this heat to the correct tissue depth. Again, I can't say that word, I am sorry. Sun et al. In a study on the forearm found the maximal elevation temperature in the skin in subcutaneous tissues occurred within 20 minutes of superficial heating, whereas the muscles required 30 minutes to hit their peak increase. No further increases on temperature or blood flow occurred when the heat continued up for 2 hours. As for collagen, tissue temperatures exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. There is also a 25 increase in potential elongation, I'm assuming 25%. Warren also found that elevating tendon temperature to 45 degrees for optimal stretching without damage. This is the part where the article... Okay, I went too far. Alright, so heat. I personally do not heat up my tissues. However, I know it is a huge thing for a lot of people. I'm going to put it in the category of doesn't hurt. However, I know M9 is not necessarily a fan of using heat because in his opinion, if you're able to stretch further, you're not causing the stretch or the stress to the tissues because it's, more loose, therefore it can handle more stress. It really depends on how you look at it. I don't think either is technically wrong because at some point you are going to hit the stress rate. It just depends on how much value you put into total stretch length towards your gains. Personally, again, I would save heat for when you need it. So if you hit a plateau and you're like, I don't know why I'm not gaining, you can add heat and then the healing in elongated state, and then you can continue to move forward. Because all of this is just like a multiplier for the stimulus in a sense. Number 5, this part of the article would seem to suggest that a regular heating pad may work just as well as an AR ultrasound method of heating. The most important variable to consider is choosing the modality of administering heat and the depth of the temperature penetration required to reach restricted tissues. Borel pointed out that given the small volume of the hand, the most superficial heat modalities provided adequate depth of heat, while larger areas needed to focus on deep tissue is for ultrasound treatments, essentially. Okay, so yeah, I never really understood the need for infrared, other than like all the benefits you can get hormonally, which I'm still on the fence about. Most of you guys are not rocking a forearm thick penis. You are not going to need an ultrasound device to heat up your penis. The nice thing about ultrasound devices is that some of them allow you to choose the target temperature. When I do use heat for pumping, and it's normally just in the winter because my office gets to about 60 degrees, hence the hoodie, I just wrap it around the tube and let it sit about at 115 degrees on the what's it called? On the thermostat. And then my sessions last about 30 minutes to an hour, so I will eventually hit the targeted heat. Also, my heating pad's only like, it's literally from JCPenney's, so it's just like a copper band or copper laced inside coil to heat up the 6. I found this part really interesting. I've seen various theories on the optimal application of heat and potentially following the stretching up to with a cold to freeze the fibers in place. This intuitively always made sense to me, but according to this article, this leads to less tissue elongation. The article asserts the optimal protocol is heat before and during stretching. The cold application leads to worse results. By the way, there is a chart included that compares the results for stretching alone, then stretching with heat, then stretching with ice. In the stretching followed by ice, the best result was the heat stretching combination. This was comparing gain in range of motion in shoulders injuries, so it's not necessarily 1-to-1 with PE, but the wrong gains alone were from heat were almost 6 times better than stretching alone. This to me would seem to support that the hypothesis for heat really helps, but the cold and icing afterwards is not helpful and potentially detrimental to gains. Okay, so first, I'm just speaking from my experience. I go into tanning beds before vacations for about a month or 2. If I work out right afterwards, say I do my leg mobility stuff, I am literally able to stretch 6 inches farther. Like I can grab past my ankle, which I normally can't do. So yes, heat definitely helps with tendon flexibility. Now, the theory behind heat then cold reminds me of when you're like forging a blade, because you'd hit it while it's hot, stretch out the thing, and then you quickly dip it into flash freeze it into the shape. However, we are not metal beings. At least I don't think most of you are. Could see how that instant contraction of the cold would cause detrimental to gains because you're constricting blood flow to the area. Therefore, you're not actually going to limit how much nutrients can get to this already limited supply tissue. So my best understanding would be if you're going to use heat, just let it cool down via room temperature afterwards. And your best bet is to put on clothes right afterwards to limit that transfer of heat out. You probably want to do some sort of progressive overload to summarize, you probably want to have some kind of progressive overload for length in your sessions for best results. However, this does increase the risk of injury, so proceed with caution. An injury that would mostly be blisters, especially if you're back hanging. Then, healing in elongated state, go for it, but I would say hold off to it until you plateau. Heat, to me, it's never made a difference, except for girth, and I just expand more, which again, it could be an indicator for more gains. We need to see a little more research for that. But the ability to stretch the tissues has a positive indicator to how big your erection can be, right? So yeah, probably use heat. Don't fret about getting the $100 heat pad. You can literally mine's $15. So don't stress unless you literally are thicker than my forearm. If so, congratulations, what are you still doing here? And then you probably don't want to cool down your penis afterwards. Because we are not forging blades, unfortunately. Let's see. It's really interesting. I'm not trying to steal this guy's thunder. I just wanted to make sure that his message actually got out. I have a bigger platform, so I wanted to make sure Nanobots had a sufficient audience because a lot of these scientific posts sometimes get overlooked. His was exceedingly well done, so he got the upvotes that he deserved. But sometimes they are a little... I don't want to say far-fetched, but it's a little harder for the layman to understand, and that's why I am here to help those guys that are not necessarily scientifically inclined to understand these theories. So, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. If you liked this video, let me know, and I will try to make more of these community highlights videos. Patreon, Peak Male Physique for men's health aids, Leviathan, sups.com for pre-ordering my and Hank's supplement line. This is BD signing off.